I could rappel before I could drive. Now, my wife will tell you that she probably feels safer when she's rappelling with me than when she's riding with me. But be that it is as it may, I taught myself how to rappel using a rope system I devised for climbing trees. And then I realized that it was more fun to slide down the rope than it was to work your way up the rope. And so I began to play in trees at a very young age using this rope system that I had created. I invented my own version of a Swiss seat I call the Joe Spider Modified, and used it to climb trees, and then would use a friction management system to lower myself out of the tree, and would bound like I was the guy from the SWAT team on the 1972 TV show. The senior class of Oxford High School got to take some college visits. And in the early spring, we got to visit Gadsden State Community College. And I remember on that beautiful spring day walking up and standing at the bottom of the ROTC rappelling tower. Well, out of nowhere, this guy appears wearing fatigues, spit shine boots, his fatigue pants bloused into the top of his boots. He had a patch on his jacket that said Jungle Expert. And he walked out, and with that military bearing, he introduced us to the M1 Standing Vertical Structural Object for Vertical Applications, or some such overblown military jargon. Well, we stared in wide-eyed wonderment and asked innocently about the nature of such a contraption. And Sergeant Rock enthusiastically explained to us about air assault and about rappelling operations, and invited us to go to the top. Now, this is what I had been hoping for. This is what I had been waiting on. Now, my wish came true, probably not because I was standing there looking in wide-eyed wonderment at this tower, but simply because I was surrounded by some of the girls from the class of 1981. And I think in his evil brain, he was hoping the girls would climb to the top of the tower with him. As it turned out, the only people to go to the top of the tower were me, a couple of band kids, and a girl named Cindy. And Cindy is the same girl from the skating rink when I wrecked my shoulders. There were no athletes. There were no quarterbacks. There were no wide receivers. There were no cheerleaders. There were no sprinters. There were no forwards from the basketball team. There were no wrestlers. Just a couple of band kids, the senior class president, who was also the cartoonist for the school newspaper, and this girl. Well, he tied us up in this version of a Swiss seat, and this was a true Swiss seat made out of these twisted ropes the military used. They used to make this twisted climbing rope called Gold Line. I think the military used a version called Green Line. We wrapped these things around our waist and under our thighs, and were given a carabiner and a pair of gloves, and to the top of the tower we went. Now, I had been rappelling way before I'd ever seen this tower. I'd been rappelling on Cheaha Mountain. I'd been rappelling at Steele. We had rigged ropes in the old horse block Ranger Tower, the Forest Service Ranger, and swung from side to side on the thing, technically trespassing, but we were there. And so we got invited to go to the top of this thing, and I wasn't going to turn it down. So here we go, donning our harnesses. We get to the top of the tower. Now, the problem with rappelling off of a tower is you have this sharp angle. You have the horizontal plane that you're standing on, and then you have the vertical plane that you're trying to get to. And that's a little bit of a difficulty. And maybe this is too much explanation, but think about a triangle. I'm standing up, and so from my feet to my harness, to my waist, is the base or the leg of a triangle. And from my feet to where the rope is tied to is another leg of that triangle. And whatever that rope is anchored to, it comes from that anchor to my waist, which makes the hypotenuse of the triangle. Well, if you're leaning against the rope, and that rope is the hypotenuse of that triangle, until that triangle folds and that top part, the rope lays on the ground, you're fighting gravity in 3 or 4 different planes. You see, gravity wants you to hang perfectly straight. I don't care what you've got, a bag, a bottle, a brick, a barbell. If you hang it on a string, at some point it is going to move to where it hangs perfectly vertical. Now, in order to do that, you've got to have your side to side managed. You got to have your up and down managed. Well, when you're going over the edge of a sharp rock or the edge of a tower, and you've got that gap between where the horizontal plane is and where that rope is actually running, until those two planes touch each other, you're being pulled left, you're being pulled right, you're being pulled backwards, and you're being pulled down. And that's a very, very tricky part of rappelling. In the manuals, they refer to that as negotiating the lip, getting from the horizontal plane to the vertical plane. Now, what you're really supposed to do is just back up to the edge of the thing, hang your heels off the edge, slightly bend at the knees, and then just sit back. Now, the sitting back part is hard because you're really born with only two fears. You're born with the fear of loud noises, and you're born with the fear of falling backwards. And everything else that you are afraid of, you've learned to be afraid of. You're not really born fearful. You're only born with two of those fears. And leaning backwards off of a high structure, you've got to overcome one of those natural inborn survival fears that you're born with. Now, when you're rappelling, most people think that they're holding themselves up. They're holding onto the rope and they're generating strength with their hands. And that's not right. The rope does the holding. If you're using a rope properly, the rope is holding you up. You're not holding yourself up. But if you don't take the tension out of that rope, if you don't have your body leaned against it where there's no slack in the rope, if you're trying to hold yourself up and you're leaning forward and you're cheating, you're creating slack in that rope so that when you lean over, and if you make a commitment move, you just lean over that horizontal and then you break into the vertical, you got all this slack and you can do some really interesting stuff. You can fall dynamically to your left, you can fall dynamically to your right, or you can do as the band kid did and fall straight backwards and turn upside down on the tower to the applause and cheers of his classmates. Well, we got this kid straightened out and got him safely to the ground. His name was Robert Bonaranto. And then it was the girls' turn. And so Mr. Jungle Expert got her all harnessed up and she eased over to the edge and she got her feet, her heels over the edge and she began to lean back and she did a pretty good job and she kind of just, rapidly took about 2 steps, out of control steps, but, getting herself lined up with gravity. Mr. Gravity never sleeps. He always pays attention. Well, he pulled her right and he pulled her left and then she's there. But her rope is about a foot from touching the tower. Well, now she's on the vertical side, but she doesn't feel like she's in control. She feels like she's got to have a death grip on this rope and hold herself up, and she's trembling. And all she's got to do is take a couple of steps, and the rope will touch the top of the tower, and then all the pressure is relieved, and it's just about having fun. But she can't. She can't move. She's holding on to this, and she's got her feet locked. And Sergeant Rock lay down on his belly and slid out over the edge just where his head appears. And he's sweetly talking to this young, beautiful girl. And she was frozen. And she was terrified. And he praised. He cajoled. He honeyed. He sugared. He sweeted. He used his inside, I'd like to take you to dinner voice. And then at some point, his ability to command and his expertise as a rappel master came to be suspect. So he put his hands flat on the tower and pushed himself away, just slid backwards like you were on one of those mechanic creepers get under a car. He just slid backwards and he got to his knees. And then he lunged over the tower. I thought he jumped. I thought, well, this girl's giving him such a hard time, he's killed himself. But he lunged over the tower, got about chest deep outside and said, "You get off my rappelling tower, you get off now." And that drill sergeant voice broke into her brain some way, and she pointed her little toes like a ballerina, and she took like 20 or 25 little bunny hops and just beep, 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 bounced right off the tower. Well, now Mr. Jungle Expert Sergeant Rock guy is frustrated. He turned around and growled, "Who's next?" And I sort of raised my hand because I thought he's going to shut the whole thing down. And so he gets me out and he starts wrapping the carabiner. And I said, "Well, can I use my left hand instead of my right hand?" "Well, why in the world would you want to do that?" Well, I didn't answer him that I'd been doing it for years with my left hand so I could use a spray gun or so I could paint or I could draw on stuff. I just feel more comfortable with my left hand. So he gets me rigged up so I can rappel with my left hand as my brake hand. And he yells down to the guy at the bottom who's controlling the safety. He goes, on rappel. And the guy yells, on belay. And he goes, we're rappelling. Rappel on. And I ease over the edge and I take my 2 little steps to get planted. Then I walk down a little bit so the rope touches the top of the tower. And then I took a couple of extra steps to get some length, because you've got to have length between your anchor point and your harness or you can't get a good swing. And then once I felt like I had enough swing, I took 2 beautiful bounces, landed on the ground, and flared my rope just like Mark Shearer did on the opening sequence of the 1970s TV show SWAT, much to the delight, approval, and applause of my classmates, athletes, cheerleaders, and all. And very much to the displeasure of the already angry and frustrated jungle expert who seemed to materialize out of thin air from the top of the tower to the ground beside me. He got in my face and said, you've done this before, haven't you? And I said, no, sir, not on this tower. And that broke his anger. He realized that I was a kid who loved to rappel, and I just never had the opportunity to rappel on a tower. And he forgave me of my subterfuge, which probably me looking at the tower like I did started the whole thing. I've, like I said, been rappelling since I was probably 14 years old, if not a little bit younger. And I've rappelled everywhere that anybody's ever allowed me to rappel. And even in some of those places I had permission. I've rappelled off buildings, inside buildings, off rafters, out of canopies, down stairwells, down elevator shafts, out of helicopters, into pits underground, into gravel pits. I've rappelled into sinkholes. One of my favorite places to rappel is a place called B Rock. Now, I think if you've got a standing rock anywhere in any state, you've got a rock named B Rock. Apparently people like to name rocks for the bees that hang out on them. And I don't know if it's the bees' nest there or they just like to be around the vertical surface where the sun warms them. But there's B Rocks in every state I've ever been to. I found a B Rock. Well, this B Rock was really close to where I went to college. And it's probably about 120-foot drop. And the first 50 feet from the top is just smooth, flawless rock. There may be a tiny crack system in it, but honestly, it's such an unmarked rock, I don't think it's climbable. But boy, it's a beautiful place to rappel. Because what I discovered accidentally is that in rappelling at B Rock, you have to anchor to this massive tree, and it's quite a bit of ways from the edge. But you tie into this tree and then you have to go down this slope, and you get down this slope before you get to the edge where you drop off. And doing that, you take that triangle that we talked about and you actually stand it up. You actually end up with your anchor point, the thing that you're tied to, connected to your waist, and that is higher than your waist. So you've eliminated this negotiating the lip. You've eliminated the forces that pull you 3 different ways when you go from standing on the horizontal to standing on the vertical. It totally eliminates all those pressures. And I accidentally discovered that at B Rock and at another place real close to B Rock. There's this pumping station. It's this little building that's built out into the current of the Little Red River. And in order to service this thing, they built these stairs. Now, these stairs were not OSHA approved. This is way before OSHA. I think they were built in 1939, or at least refurbished in 39. I read an article on it. There's 229 of these steps, and they're narrow concrete steps, and they just stick out of the side of this valley. And in some places, you're stepping up high enough that your knee is close to your chin when you're walking up these steps. I've climbed them many, many times wearing a backpack with a rope. But if you get to the bottom of them, there's this little pumping station, and from the stairs to the pumping station is this elevated walkway. Well, that elevated walkway may be 25, 30 feet above this little trail that goes by the river. Well, you walk up 10 or 12 steps and you walk out on this little bridge, and there's an I-beam, a massive structural steel beam. You throw your rope over and you can rappel the 20 or 30 feet there and walk up some steps and do it again, and walk up some steps and do it again. You can get 50 reps in about an hour. And so you can practice anything you want to do on a rope. You can practice tie-offs. You can practice lock-offs. You can practice regular rappelling. You can practice Australian rappelling. You can do Karl Mossoff rappelling. I learned most of what I learned how to do technique-wise rappelling on this little bridge. because I had eliminated the transition. The rope was hanging above me, and I just had to clip into it and step off. There was none of this fighting gravity, none of this fighting the multiple planes of pull. And so I learned from B-Rock and this little rappelling station to make this thing easier when you go from standing on the flat ground to standing on the horizontal or the vertical plane. I learned how to manage that by simply raising my anchor point. Now, you got to be careful not to raise your anchor point too high on a weak tree. So you got a solid anchor that's low, and then you can redirect your rope on something that you wouldn't use as an anchor point, but you could use it as a redirection. But I've learned for years that if I'm going to rappel and I'm going to make this transition, and basically describing the transition is I'm standing on the horizontal plane and I'm safe and I'm secure. Well, I'm about to make a move so that I'm not just standing on the horizontal plane, but I'm going to stand on the vertical plane. Instead of my toes pointing flat with the earth, my toes are going to point skyward, and I'm going to be standing on the side of a wall. I'm going to go from the horizontal to the vertical. And then I'm going to be in the vertical environment for a long, long time until I get to the bottom. And then when I get to the bottom, I'm back on the horizontal plane. I'm going from a period, a place where I'm stable, and I'm going through some things that are scary. I feel out of control. It even feels dangerous. And I'm going to have that experience until I get back on the ground, a place of stability. And so instead of calling that negotiating the lip, I call that the transition. And transitions are hard. Transitions are those things where I'm at a stable place in my life and something happens or something doesn't happen. And I go through a period where I feel out of control and I feel scared. But eventually I end up in a place where I'm stable again. I'm in grammar school. I'm going to middle school. I'm in middle school. I'm going to high school. I'm in high school. I'm going to college. I'm in college and I decide it's not for me. I'm going into the workforce. Or I graduate college, I go into the workforce. I'm single and I get married. Or I'm married and I'm suddenly single again. I used these substances and realized I had to quit. Anytime you go through a transition, I'm at a place where I'm stable. I go through instability or something that's frightening and end up at a place where I'm stable again. That's called a transition. And rappelling and using the transition as an object lesson, that's the very first time I ever used experiential education. It's the very first time I ever used facts, concepts, and application. Because you see, if you take the simple negotiating the lip, if you take that simple transition in rappelling and you apply it to any transition in life, if you break it down and you analyze it, you know how to manage your transitions. And here's the elements for managing a transition. I'm on the horizontal. I'm about to go to the vertical. Well, before I make that transition, I've got to be anchored to something. And my anchor point has to be higher than me. And it has to be stronger than me. And if you're trying to protect yourself and you're trying to gain stability in a transition, and you're connected to something that's not higher in you and stronger than you, you're going to have catastrophic system failure. You can't be locked into something that's not true. You can't be locked into something that's not real. You can't be locked into something that doesn't have the strength, more strength than you and more power than you. And you really can't be locked into something that's on your same level. You really need to be locked into something that's higher than you. Second thing you've got to have make a transition is not only do I have to have an anchor point that is higher than and stronger than me, I've got to be connected somehow to a system. Because just having that anchor point is no good if I'm not connected to it via a rope or via a harness or using a carabiner. And if I'm not locked into some kind of a system, then I can fail at any time. I can fall at any time. And falling is really what you're kind of trying to avoid, but at the same time, you're going to the bottom. When you're rappelling, everybody's afraid to fall. Well, if you fail, you just go to the bottom faster. Well, you're going to the bottom regardless. You're just going to manage how you get there. And you do that by being connected to something higher and stronger than you. And then you do it with a connected system. I'm connected. The rope connects to the anchor connects to the rope. I'm connected to the rope via my harness. And then there's a guy at the bottom that's holding the rope. I'm connected to this whole system. And if you're trying to negotiate transitions and you're not connected to a system, you're going to utterly fail. You're going to fall. The third thing you have to have in negotiating a transition is you're going to have a communication system. Just like we did on the tower, where you say, hey, I'm on rappel, I'm on belay, I'm rappelling, rappel on. Then you communicate to that guy the whole time, hey, give me some more slack, or open the rope up, or let me go faster, or whatever. If you're going through a transition and you don't have somebody you're communicating with, you're probably not going to go through that transition optimally. We really don't do well when we live in isolation. And we don't do well when we isolate ourselves from emotions. We don't do well when we isolate ourselves from information. We don't do well when we isolate ourselves from resources. So not only do we have to be connected to a system, we've also got to communicate with the system. And then the last, and maybe one of the most important parts of negotiating this transition, is I've got to have something that manages my friction. Because you see, if you grab a hold of a 10.5 or 11 millimeter rope and you just grab it and decide, hey, I'm going to slide over this edge, I guess there's a distance where you could slide down a rope, hands and feet. I guess there's a distance where you could, wrap it around your shoulder and your leg and walk down. But at some point, friction wins. At some point, it will burn your system up. At some point, it'll blister your hands and you'll have to let go. And when you let go, you no longer are connected. You fail and you fall. You see, when you're rappelling, you manage friction in a couple of ways. Number one, you wear a set of gloves. And the gloves protect you from the friction. They don't allow your hands to overheat. They don't allow your hands to blister. And then you can maintain contact. Second thing you do is you've got some kind of device. You've got a carabiner or a figure eight or some kind of marketed thing where it's a mechanical device, but the rope runs through it. And what that device does is it takes the friction of the rope that would normally burn you up or burn you out, and it uses that friction to control you. It uses that friction to slow you down. It uses that friction to stop you. And then you usually, if it's not some kind of, strange, extenuating circumstance, you've got somebody at the bottom holding your rope or somebody at the top with an extra rope, and they help you manage your friction. And if you don't have a way to manage your friction in a healthy way, something to insulate you from the friction, something to control the friction and use it in your favor, or somebody that can step in and say, hey, you're not managing this friction well, let me intervene. If you don't have that, then it's catastrophic system failure. So when you talk about managing a transition, and I think about, hey, here I'm at the top, and here I'm at the bottom, and I'm okay at the top and I'm okay at the bottom, but I'm super, super scared of the trip. I'm scared about breaking over the edge. I'm scared about being in this strange vertical environment. It's interesting when you talk about managing the transition, you're actually still falling. You see, what makes you fall is gravity. And if you get on top of that tower, you get on top of that rock, and you step over the edge, Mr. Gravity never sleeps, you're going to the bottom. Well, gravity is the same thing that allows you to rappel. You get over the edge and you release enough of that rope so that the friction is not bound and you can slide down. You're still going from the top to the bottom. Using an anchor point, using connectedness, using communication, and managing friction doesn't change what's happening. It changes the pace at which it happens, and it changes how it happens. One of the principles we teach in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is whoever manages the pace manages the encounter. And in transition management, we're not changing the what. You're going from the top to the bottom. We're just making it a slower trip and a more controlled trip. We're not changing what is happening in your life. We're using the principles of transition, and we're changing how you manage the transitions in your life.